Redditors who explore abandoned places. What was the strangest slash scariest slash creepiest thing you have found? I am not a regular explorer, but I grew up in a small rural New England town, and as a kid would always venture into the woods and find neat old things. My dad noticed that I was really interested in exploring and finding old things near our land, so one day asked if I wanted to go see something that no one else he knew had known about. I jumped at the chance, and we drove off into the mountains and parked on the side of the road. We got out and walked into the woods for what felt like 45 minutes, and we came across this really small cemetery. There had to be 10 or so stones, and you couldn't really make out anything on them, but a couple of them that read something like 1802 to 1803 and 1803 to 1805. My dad said he stumbled on it as a kid, and it must have been a small family cemetery. It just kind of broke my heart thinking about how many of those stones were probably infant slash toddler. I grew up in rural New York and had a very similar experience. Out behind my house was a cornfield and a large wooded area, and deep behind the woods was a cemetery that had been disused for some time. Some of the headstones were for soldiers who had served in the Revolutionary and Civil Wars, and the most recent was probably from the 1920s. The cool slash creepy thing about cemeteries that old are the somewhat sinister messages on the tombstones. Adding a memento mori, or a reminder to the living that they would die as well, was a very popular thing to do in the 18th and 19th centuries. Some of the stones had a skull and crossbones carved into them, which was supposed to be a Puritan reminder to live a good life. But stumbling across it at 9 p.m. made me use some choice language they certainly would not have called good. Friend of mine and I explored this old abandoned house deep in the woods near his house. Going through it, we found baby grand pianos of varying sizes throughout the house. But that wasn't the weird thing. We also found letters, dated back to World War I, from a wife to her husband stationed overseas. At first, they were letters of how things were in the States, how the kids were, how life without him, and how much she loved and missed him. The more we read, though, the more the letters turned into something we weren't expecting. She had fallen out of love with him and found another man. She left him for another man while serving his country overseas. It was sad reading those last few letters. So I grew up in a relatively rural part of upstate New York. Out in the middle of nowhere, there was this abandoned cement factory that had been left to fallow for decades. It was a huge facility out in the middle of the woods, had its own living space, officers, generator building, and rock crusher. Both were massive pieces of equipment in a hangar-sized room and underground tunnels. On top of that were the silos, maybe 10 or 15 stories tall, with corrugated metal stairs that take you all the way to the top. Anyways, we would explore these tunnels from time to time, and one day we found a room at the bottom of one of the silos. It was completely dark, maybe about the size of a small bedroom and square, with what could only be described as a 3-foot wide, floor-level moat, filled with brackish water that went down maybe 5 or 10 feet. The water was almost perfectly at floor level, so if you didn't use a flashlight or watch where you were going, it would have been incredibly easy to fall into it. In the center of the room was a box, maybe 7 feet long by 3 feet wide, and maybe 4 feet tall. The goddamn thing looked like a casket. This room was the creepiest place I've ever been in. Perfectly silent, weird moat, no light. Don't get me wrong, as a teenager I thought it was the coolest place ever. But if I were writing a horror novel about an entombed vampire escaping his prison, this is where I would start it. Sadly, the facility is no longer easily accessible these days. There's private security, and I think it's being used as a repair site for Amtrak trains that pass through. It's kind of a pity. I loved exploring this place. I have very fond memories of climbing to the top of the silos and just watching the stars. I feel like every kid needs a place. For me, it's always the evidence that a place isn't abandoned that I find scariest. I love poking around in places I shouldn't be just for the joy of seeing a rare sight, but the moment I see a tent, bedroll, or telltale toilet tissue tower, I turn right the hell around. I don't want to surprise a squatter. I'm confident in saying that I get more conversational with your standard panhandlers, gutter punks, and vagrants than most, and I find that even the ones who are laid back tend to get their hackles up if someone surprises them at a camp they thought was hidden. That and track traffic. If a railway runs through your city or town, specifically an old freight line, Chances are that half of it is more or less out of use, and has a variety of ramshackle locations that could be very fun to poke at. That said, I've been on disused tracks and had specially outfitted pickups and motorized handcars sneak up on me pretty fucking close before I realized they were coming up on me. And tell you what, I dive into the bushes every time. I don't know how much they'd care if they saw me, and I don't wish to find out. My cousin's grandmother's old house. She lived 100 meters from where we live, and when I was 1 to 2 years old she died. I went to explore her house, since we are the closest building to her house. When I tried the door it was locked, so I went up on a broken window and climbed in. I didn't expect much, since it was a pretty tiny house. It did have an attic but no basement, or I just couldn't find it. So I started looking some places up, her bedroom, living room, and such. I found some kind of closet, or something like that. It was pretty big for a closet, but I opened the door, and I got scared as fuck. There was some kind of mannequin. It had a dress on. Black, like something you would wear in a funeral. I just decided to leave after that. I was walking with a friend, and we were trying to find a quicker route back to where we were staying. We were walking on a road next to the ocean, which was quite a bit below us. We thought it would be more scenic to walk on the beach, so we climbed down only to discover it wasn't going to be easy walking. Where we expected sand, there was boulders, and we had to climb and jump in order to keep going forward. And it was pretty abandoned. Clearly, this wasn't a public area, and the road we were walking on was out of sight. After a while, I saw a cave that sort of looked like it had a green net covering the entrance. My friend was, rightfully, freaked out, but I was insistent on looking inside. I climbed over to it and pulled the curtain away, only to see massive piles of abalone shells. There were thousands of them. We had found a poacher's hiding place for their shells. Where I'm from, poachers are normally armed, and pouching abalone shells is quite illegal, so it's scary to think that we could have been attacked and nobody would have been able to even hear us. At the time, my friend and I were 13. I was looking in some old motel, little rooms, on a rural South Carolina highway. I was working as a photographer for TV news. We were doing stand-ups, and the reporter was trying to think of what to say. I went exploring. I was going toward the center building on the back row of the motel when my reporter said he was ready. So, I shot the stand-up and we left. 2 days later we got a call from the sheriff's office asking about what we were doing there. We told him. It turns out there was a dead man hanging from some vines tied to the ceiling of the room. He had been beaten and hanged. I was a few feet from finding this dead person. The motel is nearly rotted into the ground today. I think the word pine was in the name of the motel. I once entered the abandoned submarine base of the Soviet Navy in Balaclava in 2002, before it became a museum. I was led by a group of street urchins who knew the base like the back of their hands. Maybe they were the sons of officers who once lived there. I don't speak a word of Ukrainian nor Russian. They led me through tunnels whose humidity created a fog that enabled my flashlight to illuminate only 10 to 15 meters. The manholes and anything remotely useful were removed by scrap iron looters, to the point I spent more time watching my steps rather than where I was going. I found outlines in the paint on the walls of staircases leading to an upper floor. I saw the flooded tunnels that offered refuge to the submarines of the Red Navy, surrounded by old rusted gantries, suspended platforms, and bridges too big to be carried away by looters. I found an email scrawled on the wall. I took a photograph, emailed it to the address, but I never got a reply. The coolest thing was the schematic diagram of a torpedo painted on the wall. At some point I may have been convicted as a spy for that. There was this old condemned hospital in Maryland that I visited in high school, as a dare because all the cool kids did it. Found a room that was literally filled with prosthetic limbs. That was some weird shit. Another time I had a girlfriend who loved exploring abandoned places. So we went to this old school/dorms place, and apparently the gym had been turned into a breeding/nesting place for vultures. The scene was just creepy, and I'll never forget the smell. I've done a lot of urban exploration in abandoned houses, psychiatric institutions, hospitals, etc. I think one of the strangest things I've ever found was inside of a housing building at an abandoned psychiatric facility. This facility was unique as it had about 100 buildings on the property. and this particular building I was in was used as living space for people who were being prepared for transitioning back into everyday life. It was basically like a small hospital with 15 bedrooms and some staff rooms. I was with a friend, and we were exploring the bedrooms with our flashlights, and I walked through the doorway into one of the bedrooms, and there's a full-size male white-tailed deer with antlers, probably 4 feet across, standing about 5 feet in front of me in the middle of the bedroom. He froze, I froze, and then my friend came up behind me, saw the deer, screamed, and ran. As soon as my friend screamed, the deer jumped and turned around and ran into the wall. I didn't stick around long enough to see where he went next, LOL. Found an old school bus sitting out in the middle of the woods. It had been converted for living, complete with a small kitchen and a wood stove. On the table was a deck of cards, an overflowing ashtray, and a cup that had coffee in it that had long since dried out. Clean dishes in the dish rack covered with dust and mouse droppings. Cupboard doors open in the kitchen showed cans of Campbell's soup, condensed milk, and boxes of crackers that had been ransacked by mice. The bed was trashed by animals, pillows ripped apart, and the stuffing spread all over. Underneath the shredded blanket, the leg of a teddy bear peeked out. Old books on the bedside table had swelled up from getting wet and were covered in mold. Ragged curtains with a cheerful flower print hung around the windows. Outside, a rusted swing set stood between the trees, the one swing covered in moss. An old pickup truck was parked nearby, although there was no sign of a road anywhere. Split firewood was stacked against the side of the bus. The creepiest thing about it? The bullet holes that covered the rear window. There's a hunting road right next to my house. I live in Georgia on a big hill. Everything used to be peach orchards, so the ground is stair-stepped in certain places. One thing I've noticed, rock piles. Random rock piles everywhere. Big and long enough for a body, for sure. Not just dirt mounds from fallen trees, piles of rocks. I would suspect Native American origin, but pretty much all of Georgia has been logged at some point. All the trees are pretty young. But I dunno. I did find a dark-ass abandoned shack. A big bird lives around it. Not a vulture, it's shaped different. I didn't see it at first, but when I approached the building it flew off and scared the shit out of me. The shack didn't have much except an old shower chair. The type they make so that disabled people can sit down in the shower. It was dark though and pretty creepy looking through it.